All right. So streaming, if you paid attention to the syllabus, I know it's been a long time since anybody's probably read that. There's a disclaimer on there that says I will like YouTube or broadcast this on YouTube, right? So I do that. So if anybody misses, they can access the live feed and see what happened in class. It's a handy tool. I did it long before COVID. I started this, so I have literally thousands of hours of me YouTubing. I keep trying to make money off of this channel, but you know, marketing ethics is just not a huge seller. I don't know why, because I am pretty entertaining. I had a student evaluation one time that said, "You're not funny." I mean, I am.
That hurts.
I'm hysterical. This is the Brandon Geary Comedy Hour. So anyway, just to point out the syllabus. I know some of you are going to be really, really disappointed by this. Today, or this week, we're going to talk about the meaning and value of work, and that's a nice topic to come back to, even though the really hard stuff was at the beginning, and it's in those lectures that I listed in the videos for you to watch if you wanted to watch the lectures, you know, on the ethical theories. That's the really tough stuff, in my opinion. This is a nice chapter because your article reviews are due on the 28th, if you look at that. So it says article review, please see the requirements at the end of this document. And so you'll have to submit those to the Dropbox. And what I want is I don't want just a synopsis of the article that you're reviewing. I want you to make an argument. Fundamentally, life is about making arguments. For those of you who are sales students, I tell sales students that one of the things that this class will help you do is focus and sharpen your ability to make arguments, which are absolutely fundamental in sales, because objections in sales are fundamentally your customer arguing with you about why they don't need your product or service, right? An objection is, I really can't afford it, I don't need it, and you have to make an argument that overcomes that objection. So this course is really, really beneficial in developing some of those soft skills that allow you to make arguments for those of you who are going to go into sales, where you will be making arguments all the time. If you're not going into sales and you're just a marketing major, you're still going to have to make arguments. You're going to present ideas to your boss or to directors at a corporation as to why they should accept your marketing plan or why they should accept your ideas for integrated marketing communication in terms of what your company should be doing to sell more, market itself to customers out there. Even if you're not directly involved in selling, fundamentally, you're going to make a lot of arguments. And so the meaning and value of work is one of those areas where we can make a lot of arguments. There are chapters which are just sort of, this is substantive stuff that you have to learn. And then there are chapters that really allow us to expand on ideas and work through problems. And fundamentally, what the article review is teaching you how to make sound arguments. So there was a whole video earlier in the semester, if you haven't watched it, on how to make arguments, on the rule book for arguments, which is the little book that I assigned that you can read. It's a very pithy book in one setting. So we're going to talk about the meaning and value of work. And there are lots of arguments about work because it's a controversial topic. You will spend the best years of your life at work. One of the reasons that I chose to do this rather than being a corporate officer, which I was, and I made far more money as a corporate executive vice president and chief general counsel at a publicly traded company than I do doing this, is that ultimately that work I didn't find terribly fulfilling. And I worked for a good company. I mean, we were an educational software publisher, and we produced products that really helped students, particularly students in poor performing school districts. But it was tedious and boring, and I didn't necessarily get to see the fruits of that labor the way I do with, for example, teaching sales and coaching sales teams and watching our sales students get really good jobs. So I left the corporate world I got the PhD and I came back here to teach. I used to be actually UCO's Associate General Counsel at one time before I left for the corporate world. And I came back to teach, and that's been a far more fulfilling job. And I think most of you, the reason you're in this classroom today is that you want something that resembles a more fulfilling way of earning a living than just, going to work and putting in your 40 hours and slaving away. But these are arguments that we can make about the meaning and value of work. Next week, unfortunately for you, you will not have the pleasure of my company because syllabi are contracts. That's what the court's saying. I'm a lawyer, right? So syllabi are contracts. And on the assignments for next week, there's no lecture. It's to allow you to do both a quiz and a module 2 exam. So you'll have class time to do that. So we won't. I know you're just heartbroken by not having to come and sit here and listen to me lecture. If that really, really bothers you, you give me a call and I'll be happy to talk to you about marketing ethics. All right? Okay. So let's talk about the meaning and value of work. Now, why would I, and I'm going to make an argument here that, let's switch to that. I'm going to make an argument that why are we talking about work in a marketing ethics class? Shouldn't that just be part of business ethics? If you take, oops, let's see, it's fine. For some reason, it is playing recorded slide, and I can't get it to stop. I know. There we go. That'll work. Okay. So talking about work seems like it should be a management topic, right? Rather than a marketing ethics topic. There is a recognition now among corporations that we not only have to engage in external marketing, but we have to engage in internal marketing to get employees to really believe in what we're doing. Now, during the 1980s, it became very fashionable, and one of the things that I'll talk about in more depth, for corporations to get rid of older employees because they cost more. They generally have been there longer, they've gotten pay raises, and they're not as productive as somebody who's young and right out of college necessarily, right? And so large corporations shed employees at a rapid rate, older employees. They would downsize, they would have reductions in force, and then they would wait the appropriate amount of time and rehire all younger people at a lower salary who were willing to work, harder and longer to get ahead. And that became very fashionable. And so one of the questions that we have is with loyalty. Marketing, if you take my principles class, you'll hear me say it over and over and over again. And for those of you who've had me for principles, is the only fully integrated function of the firm. What does that mean?
You say that again.
Marketing is the only fully integrated function of the firm. What do I mean by that? Unlike every other discipline in business, marketing is a pervasive activity that seeks to add value across all aspects of the firm. You can start a business and know nothing about management theory. You can start a business and not have to manage anybody. I could start a business. I have a business. I have a couple of businesses. I still practice law on the side. I have a very boutique practice. I don't have any employees in that business. I sue institutions of higher education that fire tenured professors. And I make money at it. I don't have any employees. I don't have to manage anybody, right? Management is by definition directing other people to do things, to accomplish work. I don't have to manage anybody. I do it all on my own. Computers are a wonderful thing. In the olden days, attorneys had secretaries who would type because attorneys couldn't type generally. They believed they were above typing. I fortunately grew up in an age where you learned how to type because you learned how to keyboard. Right? I grew up with computers. I'm a Gen Xer. And so I learned how to type, so I don't have to have a secretary to type all my stuff. My former boss, who was general counsel here at UCO, who's retired now, he always had a secretary, and he still hunts and pecks. He would like write things out in longhand, or he would dictate them and then have a secretary type up his legal documents. So I don't have to know anything about management. As long as I make enough money in my law practice to not starve to death, I don't have to know anything about finance. I don't have to know anything about the stock market. I don't have to know anything about accounting. Debits on the left and credits on the right. I do have to know something about marketing in order to get clients, right? And so marketing is a pervasive activity. And we now have to recognize that we just don't market to our customers and clients. We also have to market to our employees. And companies now recognize that, yes, you can get rid of any employee, but what's the cost? If you get rid of a salesperson, if you have to fire a salesperson, it can cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's estimated that if it's a high enough employee in a company, you will spend 1.5 times their annual salary in lost productivity and recruitment costs to replace that individual. And you lose, the knowledge that they had of the corporation and the product. And you have to engage in training, and all of that's expensive. So work is important, and marketers are interested in work because we're interested in not only marketing to clients and customers, but also marketing to our employees, so that our employees will engage in what branding scholars call living the brand. An example of a company that lives the brand is Southwest Airlines. Employees of Southwest Airlines are fiercely loyal. Southwest has historically not paid the most of the airlines, but their employees are fiercely loyal to Southwest. I have 2 friends that work as A&P mechanics for Southwest. In a previous edition of the book, they talked about Pat Tillman, and I've kept this slide in here because he was a pro football player for the Cardinals. And after 9/11, he joined the Army as an enlisted man, not as an officer. And even if he had joined as an officer, you're not going to make in the United States Army what you make playing professional football. Anybody would have thought that was crazy. But he was motivated by something else beyond money. It was a sincere sense of patriotism, of wanting to do something after this tragedy that we had suffered to make it right, right? So common assumptions and some typical views about work. You will spend the best years of your life working. The years that you get, the so-called golden years at the end are for most people not that golden. Those are the adult diaper, nursing home, wheelchair, joints hurt years, right? The best years of your life right now are going to be spent working. So a conventional view of work is that it's something that we should avoid at all costs. This is an argument that work is demeaning, that it is something to be contemptuous of, that it is simply a means to an end. I give you my labor, I come down here to UCO and I teach classes in exchange for a paycheck. There are lots of jobs that are like that. I don't know anybody who says, I yearn to be a garbage man. That's my dream job. I've never met anybody who said that. I used to be on city council in Guthrie. I was vice mayor, and at that time we actually still had the we now contract that out, but at the time I was vice mayor, we still employed all of the people that collected trash. The city actually did it. Now it's contracted through Laidlaw. They do it. So, you know, I knew them. They were city employees. They lived in Guthrie. Now they don't live in Guthrie. They come in from Oklahoma City and they pick up the trash and stuff like that. And actually, being a garbage man now is not such a bad job. When I was on city council, that was in the late 1990s and early 2000s, they still actually had to pick up the trash and throw it into the, you know, it's not a bad job anymore. You ride around in a truck. Sometimes when I read students' essays, I think, Jesus, I'd really like to be a car. You know, like it's a mindless job. You ride around in a truck. It's got this arm that comes out. It picks up the trash and it dumps it into the thing. It's not really, it's an air-conditioned cab. And they make about $25,000 to $30,000 a year. You know, compared to sometimes having to read essays, which is painful and often leads to drinking, you know, in order to overcome the pain. And then I become more, you know, charitable. May not be such a bad life. The problem is, in the words of my grandmother, Grant, you have champagne and caviar tastes on a beer and weenies budget. So I have this airplane that costs an enormous amount of money to operate, you know, that I have to keep going so that I can keep myself entertained. So I can't be a garbage man. But there are days when I think about it. But I've never known anybody who said, I just yearn to do that. From the youngest age, from the time I was 4 years old, my father was an FBI agent. He was a special agent in charge. And we lived next door to an appellate judge. And so I was, you know, steeped in sort of law enforcement and the law. And I said I wanted to be a lawyer from 4 years old. That's what I wanted to be. And then I became a lawyer and I decided I didn't really want to be a lawyer, that it's not much fun. It's not a great way to make a living. I have written letters of recommendation for 26 of my students who have gone on to law school, graduated and passed the bar someplace. I have students that have passed the bar in New Mexico and Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas and Arkansas and Missouri. 26 of them. I have kept up with all of them. I tried to talk each and every one of them out of becoming an attorney. And 5 years after each one of them became an attorney, almost to the number, they have told me that they wished that they had done something else, that they had followed my advice and gone on and gotten a PhD or done something that would be more rewarding than practicing law. So how do we reconcile another view of work, which is, this is obviously going on a roll. So I got to keep going back. I apologize for that. I don't know how to stop it. I'm not that technologically advanced, apparently, to figure out how to stop the narrated PowerPoint from just playing on its automatic loop. At the other end of the spectrum, there's the view that work is where we achieve our highest potential. It's where we are able to express our most creative side. I tell students that I wanted to be a country and western superstar, but I'm a tone-deaf flat baritone. And so I had to become a college professor instead to have an audience. Hence, that's why I'm funny. Most of my colleagues, you know, do this because they have a real love of their discipline. I had no love of marketing, I will tell you that. When I decided I no longer wanted to be an attorney, I had been a college professor. As the associate general counsel, I had a split appointment and I taught part-time here. I taught legal studies. Initially, I taught in the Department of Political Science, and then I was moved over to the business because more of the law courses were taught in business than they were in poli-sci. And so I got sort of moved over to business law. But I taught lots of law courses. I taught the law of criminal procedure. I taught constitutional law. I taught business law. I taught the law of commercial transactions. So I taught all these law courses. And really, political science and the law were my passion. That's what I really loved. I didn't really think much about marketing. And when I decided I wanted to leave the corporate world, I had a friend who was a marketing professor. He taught here at UCO for many, many years. He was a full professor and an assistant department chair. His name was Dr. Huge. And I said, you know, Darryl, I think I'm going to go back. We had an airplane together. And when I decided I was going to go back to get a PhD, I said, Darryl, I need to sell my interest in the airplane because, you know, PhD schools and airplanes don't necessarily go together. They're expensive to operate. And he said, okay, well, I'll buy your part. And he said, what are you going to get? And I said, well, I've been accepted to a PhD program in political science. And he said, you don't want to do that. That's a terrible idea. And I said, why is that a terrible idea? He said, well, you'll go broke if you can even get a job. You know, you're going to make probably $25,000 to $45,000 a year, depending on where you go. You might, you know, probably end up at a junior college because there are lots of them. Why don't you get a PhD in marketing? Because there are 12 jobs for every candidate that graduated this year, and the average starting salary is $160,000 a year. And I said, you know, I don't really know anything about marketing, don't really like it. He's like, anything you can study in political science, you can study. There's political marketing, you can study political marketing. So why don't you do that instead? And I thought about it, and I looked, and there were all these jobs. There weren't very many people graduating. I thought, yeah, I can do that. Accountants make more money. They make about $200,000 a year if you get a PhD in accounting, but I didn't think I could stay awake long enough to do that. I mean, God, how boring. But this allows me, even though, you know, I chose a discipline that wasn't necessarily my first love, I can still be entertaining and I can still be funny. And it allows me to be creative. My mother is a fantastic artist. She can paint anything. And in all different kinds of mediums. She can paint in oil and acrylic, and she can even do watercolor, which is very difficult. It's not my favorite. I like oil because it's really rich in color and texture. I have lots of oil paintings in my office, if you've ever been down there. But my mother can paint. Watercolor is not forgiving. If you mess up, you throw it away, right? Oil, you can always scrape it off, paint over it. It's really a very forgiving medium. But I can't, I'm just not that talented. I can't do that. So this allows me my creative expression to stand up here and, you know, try to find new and innovative ways. It used to be easier when I was younger. I started teaching when I was 22. It was much easier for me to connect to students when I was 22 than it is now. Now I have some jokes and people don't always get them. You know, they're looking at me like, what planet did you beam down from? Because I say things like, you know, the communists have stolen all of the markers and you don't know what a communist is. Don't really remember the Cold War. So it allows me to be creative. Working with sales students. When I first started teaching sales, I didn't know anything about sales. I wanted to come back to UCO because I had a teacher's retirement that had vested here in Oklahoma. And the department head said, you know, I need you to say that you're interested in sales. I said, Stacia, I'm just not interested in sales. That's not me. You know, did my dissertation on ethics and marketing and politics and marketing. And, you know, and she said, well, I need you to say you want to do sales. And then I went to my first sales competition and I thought, this is really fun. And I saw kids getting good jobs. Well, I had to relate everything in sales to trying cases to a jury because that's selling, right? Convincing people that they should believe your client's perspective is sales. And I got better and I got better and I got better at sales. And we've developed a really competitive sales team here at UCO. We usually beat out schools like Baylor, which is a huge school. In terms of wins, we are now a top 10 placing school in sales competitions. And that is, I've developed a part of that program that has allowed us to be that successful. And so it's very creative. So there's an argument that work is where we produce our highest good. And then there's this view of work that, it's bad. So those are two arguments on the extremes. Is there a middle view of work? There is. If we think of things in terms of a Hegelian dialectic, where we have a thesis, we start out with an argument, which is called a thesis, right? And then in response to the thesis, we get an antithesis. Is there a synthesis view of work? Is there a synthesis that combines these two? There is. So, and this is not antithesis. I had a teacher once who called it the antithesis. I have a whole Oklahoma to English dictionary. I had a teacher that's the antithesis. No, it's pronounced antithesis. Lowry. He also told me that the Spanish Armada was the largest ship to sail the 7 seas. No, Lowry, like the Spanish Armada was a fleet of ships that was destroyed in what was called the Protestant wind when they attacked England, He also said that Frenchy Huguenot was this guy who settled in Canada. Just like, oh God. No, Larry, like I think you mean the French Huguenots. It's like a group of people, not one guy. So anyway, it's not antithesis, it's antithesis. So we have a thesis that is, start out with this idea that work is oppressive, it's hard, we should avoid it. It's in play that we become our most creative self. The problem is that as adults, we don't get to play very much, right? We give that up. We gotta work. It's hard. And then there's this view that says, no. In work, people like me can achieve our fullest potential. I can come here, and I guess part of my functional fiction is that I make a difference in lives of students, and I help them get jobs, and I help them go to competition and win, and isn't that a good thing? And it's enormously creative and wonderful. Well, what would be a synthesis argument? Well, the synthesis argument is that, yes, work is oftentimes tedious, and for many people, it's grueling and it's punishing. Skinning fishes at a catfish farm. If you've ever watched this happen, we have catfish farms here in Oklahoma. If you go out west, they produce a lot of catfish, and filleting catfish is a tedious, horrible job. They dump the fishes down this conveyor belt where they are shocked to death, and then somebody grabs them and puts them on this machine, which basically disembowels them. It sucks all of the innards out, and then somebody else grabs the fish and they skin it on this machine. The women, it's usually women who do this job, oftentimes have enormous pain in their joints and hands from carpal tunnel syndrome and repetitive motion stress injuries. It's not a pleasant job to do. But we produce a lot of food, and that's one food source. And most of the food industry, if you saw how it was done, you probably would not want to engage in it. When I was in the PhD program, one of my colleagues who was a vegan suggested that I watch Food Inc. Haven't you seen Food Inc.? And I watched it, and I love animals, and I was horrified by this. And I tried to become a vegetarian. The longest I went was 4 hours. I got hungry, and no, I have actually made it one day. We did try, my family, we tried something called Meatless Mondays. And then my mother developed pernicious anemia, and the doctor said, you have to eat red meat, lots of red meat. And so we went back to eating steak. And I just prefer to think that Bossy fell over dead in the field and, was served up. If you watched cattle processing, and I grew up on a cattle ranch part of the time in northern New Mexico. My father was a cattle rancher. It's not a pretty job. Feedlots are not wonderful places to work. But we have to have them. I mean, we have to produce food for people. And it's not necessarily fun or appealing. So we've got this people like me who can be very creative, and we've got this other. Well, what is in the middle? Well, the synthesis argument is that yes, work can be fulfilling, but it can also be demeaning. And so what we need to do is we need to attempt to find ways to make it just and fair and humane. That we need to find methods for those people who can't achieve their fullest potential in work to still have human dignity. Something that didn't happen a lot during the Industrial Revolution. We had children working in sweatshops. So it's this idea that, yeah, we have to have people do these kinds of things. We have to have people manufacture textiles, and that's not necessarily a great job, but what should we do? Well, we should avoid unfair labor practices. We should avoid child labor. We should pay a living wage in those places that do this, relative to the standard of living of the country in which they are in. We should avoid slave labor. Most of you don't know this, but the vast majority of the world's chocolate is produced by slave labor on the west coast of Africa. It's horrific. It's cruel. There are ways that we can go about maintaining ethically sourced chocolate. Right? You can look for Fair Trade Alliance, or you can look for Utz Good Inside. Those are ethically sourced. So how do we make this ethical? How do we do this? Well, there are sort of three levels of types of work that we can have. At the bottom is this idea that work is oppressive and it's just a job. It's just something that you have to do. Habits of the Heart, Bella et al. Talk about these types of jobs. How do we make them humane? How do we engage in ethical practices? One of the things that has happened as a result of COVID, there's not a lot that we can say that has just been a wonderful happenstance of having COVID. But one of the things that we have found is that workers now have greater leverage than they have in the past. So we've had ebbs and flows in this. During the Industrial Revolution, workers were at an extreme disadvantage with regard to the capitalist class. Many of them were immigrants from places like Ireland, and they came here and they just needed to survive. And so they were put to work in textile factories. And if your arm was cut off, textile factories are wonderful places to get your fingers and your limbs mutilated. They would simply send you home. We didn't have things like workers' compensation. Right? And then workers began to organize and began to strike, and through collective bargaining, they gained power. And the balance of power began to level out. Then we went through a period of time in which capital again gained the upper hand. And unions were seen as being bad things. Because they were, being viewed as allowing workers to be lazy and entitled. I used to have a trailer and a boat at Lake Eufaula, and our neighbors at the park where we had our trailer both worked for the GM plant here in Oklahoma City. How many of you remember the GM plant here in Oklahoma City? A few of you. They both worked for the GM plant in Oklahoma City. They both made almost, and this was in the late 1990s, they both made close to $100,000, working on an assembly line, close to $100,000 a year. And they were always at the lake because the plant here in Oklahoma City was always something like 90 days over in production. And so they were just sent home with 90% of their wages. And they'd go to the lake. They spent more. I was a college professor and they were at the lake more than I was. That's one of the reasons why cars that were manufactured in the United States cost an astronomical amount of money. Or at least that's what the argument was about organized labor. And so organized labor took a big hit, and there was this movement to offshore, and we could send the jobs overseas where there wasn't organized labor to what we might call developing world. In the old parlance, we used to call the United States and Western Europe and Japan the first world. The second world were the communist countries and their satellites. So it was Russia and their satellite nations like the Ukraine, which was a satellite, Belarus, Poland of the Russian Empire. Those were called second world countries because they had more advanced industrialization. And then we had what was called the third world. We no longer talk about that in terms of development. Now we talk about developed nations and developing nations, or newly industrialized nations. And of course, some of our nations, like the United States and many of the nations of Western Europe, have moved beyond industrialization into a post-industrial and postmodern world, where it's no longer the manufacture of tangible things that create value in our economy. It's the knowledge in people's heads that creates value. It's the financial services sector. It's banking. It's things that you can't touch. It's intangibles. But what we have with COVID is, as a result of COVID, a lot of workers had the ability to once again gain power, as manufacturers and businesses needed workers, and a huge number of people who were near retirement and baby boomers just decided that they would go ahead and retire early. And we've seen this in the trucking industry, which is one of the reasons that we have a supply chain problem. One of the many reasons why we have a supply chain problem is that literally hundreds of thousands of truckers who were, in their maybe early to mid 60s have just decided to retire. And it's created a huge problem. And it's once again allowed workers to gain an advantage with regard to their position vis-a-vis capital. So the conventional views of work that we've talked about are this primary view that it's negative. Working, which is a book by Studs Terkel, talks about how it's about anger and frustration and ulcers and injuries. And then we have another view, which is just it's hedonistic. I need this to pay my rent, as opposed to what we talked about, which is the human fulfillment model, where we can build character, develop potential. So the synthesis model by Norman Bowie focuses on the idea of allowing people free choices in their work. How do we do that? What can we do to make work better for those people who can't have the type of job that you all want? So we talked about there's three types of jobs, right? Or three levels of work. There's the job, which is, as I suggested to you, I've never met, and I would suggest that nobody in this room, if you were here, you're not going to say my dream job is to become a garbage collector. I've never met anybody who said that that was their dream job. They did it because somebody had to do it, and they maybe didn't have the skills to do something else. And with regard to that, I will tell you that one of the things that Mike Rowe, you all know who Mike Rowe is? Yeah, he did Dirty Jobs. They asked him in an interview after he completed the series, he's now gone on to do other series and other works. They asked him, what did you learn about all of these dirty jobs? And he said, well, the one thing I learned is that most of the people who did these dirty jobs were millionaires, a lot of them. They saw a need and they fulfilled the need, not necessarily all their workers, but he, you know, one of the people that he visited was a guy who did septic tanks and rebuilt septic systems. And he was a millionaire. He was, there's a book out called The Millionaire Next Door, and then there's one that followed it called The Millionaire in Mind. And what they found in studying all these millionaires is that you might be surprised. So when the authors decided to write the book, The Millionaire Next Door, they rented a very big hotel suite at I think in Dallas is where they asked these people to come. They paid for them to come, and they had caviar and shrimp cocktail and all of these things. And what they found is these people were all horrified by all of this. Most of them own things like septic tank companies, like the guy Mike Rowe interviewed. Nobody says, I want to go into septic work, but he saw a need, and there was, you know, he could develop a company, and he became a millionaire off of this company. Not glamorous, not pretty, not wonderful, but he became a millionaire. So how do we make those kinds of jobs better? I would suggest to you it's not like the guy who preceded me as vice mayor when my mother was on city council, and then she succeeded him as vice mayor. How many of you have heard about this case in Guthrie in Logan County? His name's Danny Tripplett. He had a septic tank company. That's one of the reasons I thought about this. He had a septic tank company. He had an argument with one of his employees who was having an affair with his wife. And when they were digging a septic tank, Danny shot him, put the septic tank over it, threw his body in the hole, put the septic tank over him, and buried it. And it wasn't until 2 months later that they, you know, the family kept going to the police and saying he's missing, with, you know, was last seen with Danny. And they started doing some investigations and discovered the body underneath this septic tank. That's probably not the way to treat employees, right? I mean, if you're gonna have this sort of synthetic,
That's not the way to treat your boss either.
There's lots of ethical problems involved in that whole thing. How do we allow people to have free choices in these kinds of things? What can we do to make this more humane? Well, part of it is this idea of employment at will. You're always free to leave, but are you really? People have to have more than illusory choices with regard to their work. And one of the things that, again, as a result of COVID and people leaving the workplace, and one of the things that your generation will benefit from is the fact that you will have more power vis-a-vis capital in finding jobs. And the more education you get, the more likely you are to have those types of benefits. So what can we have to help this? What can we do in terms of having rights of employees, recognizing that not everybody is going to have this human fulfillment model? That. Autonomy. What does autonomy mean? What does it mean to have autonomy as part of this model of the synthesis view, which is we're not all going to have this meaningful job where we can help students get jobs, or we can be an artist or a writer or a poet. I would suggest to you that very few poets make lots of money. You might want to reconsider that. all these people who, I was talking to a young man the other day. He had just graduated with, oh gosh, stop that. Switch it to that. He had just graduated from OU with a degree in musical theater. Great. Starved to death with that degree. What are you going to do with that? Teach. He said he was going to go to New York. Okay, that'll be short-lived, right? I mean, you're going to be waiting tables in New York or bartending. What?
She's a bartender.
There's nothing wrong with bartending. That's how I got through undergraduate. Yeah. I tended bar. I love little sleazy bars, and that's what I did. I worked in little gun and knife joints. You know what a gun and knife joint is? We search you at the door, and if you don't have a gun or a knife, they issue you one. You're probably going to need it. So, nothing wrong with that, right? I would venture to guess you don't want to continue bartending for the rest of your life.
No.
No.
Probably not.
My niece bartended, she graduated from OSU 5 years ago, and she attended bar at Texas Roadhouse all through. It's a great way to make money. I mean, it's
Flexible.
very flexible, and you can make a lot of cash very quickly. It's not like 8-hour shifts, right? So it's a great job going through college. There are two types of people that become servers and bartenders. There are those that go into it as a profession, and then there are those that do it because they're getting through college. So I had suggested to him that with a degree in musical theater, he was probably going to be looking at this as a profession. And he might want to consider a degree in professional selling, like, coming back to UCO and getting a degree in professional sales, because a lot of those skills that you have as a musical theater major, you can transfer into selling. It's all about presentation and making a connection, making people believe, that's what acting is. He told me he was still going to New York. And I told him he'd be back. Brutal honesty. That's why I'm divorced. My insignificant other said things like, "How does this dress make me look? You look like hell in pastels." Well, you look like death warmed over or a winter. Go back upstairs and put on something that is more appropriate to your skin tone.
That's humbling.
Truth hurts. So what is autonomy? It's what?
Freedom.
It's freedom. Freedom in what sense?
Choose.
One of the things Kant says is that we should never lie. Why should we never lie? If you watch my video on this, you would know that one of the reasons we should never lie, and the reason I told Robin that she looked like hell in pastels, is because if I don't, and I engage in this lie that we think is saving her feelings, I'm not really allowing her to make an autonomous decision. I'm manipulating her in a way that allows me to get out of a fight, but doesn't allow her to make, good clothing choices. And you should make good clothing choices. You should dress appropriately. One of my colleagues is horrified. I used to dress every day, because I was a lawyer. I used to dress every day in a suit and tie when I'd come to teach, and I've just sort of given that up. When they made Jeremy Aller the dean and he wears jeans every day, I thought, well, there we go. I don't need to dress up anymore. So, I sort of, my homage to that is I continue to wear slacks and nice Allen Edmonds shoes. I love Allen Edmonds shoes. Have 18 pairs of them, but I'm going to wear a polo shirt, slacks, and Allen Edmonds shoes rather than a suit and tie. And it just makes Professor Kaiser crazy because he thinks we should all wear a suit and tie every day. And I'm like, Bob, even law firms have gone away from, banks. Banks were the last bastion of having, no bank requires their tellers to wear a coat and tie anymore. He's like, well, they should. I'm like, well, Bob, that train has left the station, So he's like, well, when is the bow tie guy coming back? And I'm like, he's not. I was a lawyer, 30 years, don't really want to do it anymore. So, I still have to wear a coat and tie when I go to court. But, those days are few and far between when you practice in federal court because they really don't want you to see it. They don't want to see it. So autonomy, don't lie to people because you're manipulating them when you lie to them. Now, maybe I could be more gentle in my approach to it, right? Rather than the brutal honesty approach of you look like shit in that outfit. Maybe I should tone it down and say things like, have you thought about having a color scheme done? Because you're clearly a winter, not a summer. I don't know. So autonomy is about allowing people to make their own choices, to have free will. How do we do that in a work situation? I have a great deal, in this job, I have a great deal of autonomy. The way I teach this class, the things that we talk about, I largely select. I choose the textbook. And I could decide that we're not going to talk about the chapter on work if I wanted to. And I could just focus on, instead, really delving into the chapters on production and marketing. The product and the price and the place and the promotion. But because marketing is a holistic discipline within the business college, I've chosen to take a holistic approach. That's my choice. My department chair has nothing to say about it. Nothing. The way I teach this class is entirely up to me, for the most part. Now, if there isn't some content, and if I'm showing up drunk, well, they might, have something to say about that. Although I don't know, when I was associate general counsel here, my boss was horribly non-confrontational. He didn't like confrontation, so I was the firing lawyer. I was the one who did all of when people would file a grievance on their termination, I was the one who got to hear all of those, as the advisor to the committees and stuff like that. So I became known as the firing lawyer, and I was pretty good at it.
It's gotta be depressing.
What?
So you're basically telling people they're fired?
Yeah, the thing was I never could fire a faculty member. We had one who we refused to move his office. He was upstairs in liberal arts, the College of Hippy Dippy across the parking lot over there. And they moved the department and he refused to move. And he wouldn't allow custodial access in. And when we went in, we discovered why he wouldn't. There were like 23 boxes of Three Roses whiskey in his office. He was a serious alcoholic. And we still couldn't fire him. He had tenure. He sort of taught his classes. He was one of these high functioning drunks who could, we had another professor that stabbed a student with a pencil. I tried to fire him. Fire him.
Understandable.
Huh?
Understandable.
Yeah, they wouldn't fire him. They insisted it wasn't a stab, it was a poke. Either way, no. should be gone. So autonomy, allowing people within the realms to make decisions about their own lives. Now, obviously, there's a limit to this because if you're a manager, you have to manage people. And you can't just let them do what they want to do, right? But you should allow them some discretion, respect. How do we engage in respect? You know, the old idea of management was that you all have heard, if you've had management courses, about theory X and theory Y, right? Managers. And there are those managers that believe that employees are inherently lazy. My friend Russ, who is a marketing professor here, really interesting guy. One of the other reasons I decided to become a marketing professor was there was this guy named Russ Jones. He's a pilot. His job, he was in the Air Force. His job was to fly Air Force 2. So he flew vice presidents. The last vice president he flew was Spiro T. Agnew, who went to prison, federal prison, for accepting bribes. He was Richard Nixon's vice president, and he went to jail. And then shortly thereafter, Richard Nixon almost went to jail, right? He resigned and Gerald Ford pardoned him, so he didn't go to jail, but Spiro Agnew did. And so Russ flew Air Force 2. He flew Spiro Agnew. He's a pilot. I'm a pilot, so I really liked him. But Russ was one of these guys. He believed that people are inherently lazy, that you have to constantly watch them, and if you don't, they will take advantage of you. The antithesis view of that is that people are, just trying to get along, and they'll put in a fair, there's the exception, but there are exceptions. So how do you have, if you believe that employees are inherently lazy, and you have this view of management, how do you still engage in respect with them? How do you do that? Or if you have jobs that inherently don't allow for a great deal of discretion and autonomy, how do you still engage in respect for those people?
Maybe the fact that they're actually doing a job.
Okay. I mean, one of the things that happened in colleges of business that was sort of bad in many respects was that is the Gomez Adams duck. I love that.
I saw the eyes. I got it.
Huh?
I saw the eyes and the
Yeah.
tail.
Yeah, that's the Gomez Adams duck. I loved the Addams Family growing up. That was one of my favorite shows. So, there's all of these studies, the Taylor Scientific Management studies, where we look at, and this is an example of how bad ideas never die. Because that Taylor management BS has come back around. They now call it lean management, which is just a horrible, it's just god-awful derivative scholarship, right? I mean, it's the most banal derivative scholarship in the world. But, at the time, we have these tasks in the Industrial Revolution. So, for example, shoveling coal in steel mills, they use huge furnaces, right, to manufacture product. And so the idea is that there has to be an optimum shovel size. For every task that we have, there has to be an optimum way about doing that. So let's think about shoveling coal into a furnace, into a blast furnace. Well, what's the optimum size? If you get a bigger shovel, you can put more coal into the furnace, right? But if the shovel's too big, what happens? Yeah, the average person may take more time lifting that one, and dragging it or whatever and putting it into the furnace than is efficient. So the idea is, and this is intuitively appealing in some respect, right? That we have to find the optimum size of shovel. So how do you do that? Well, you sort of find the average worker in this job. And then you sit there and you try out different shovel sizes on them. And you stand there with a stopwatch and you time this. And through a process of trial and error and elimination, you come up with the optimum shovel size, right, for shoveling coal into a furnace. This view, along with Max Weber, who is called the father of bureaucracy, is enormously demeaning. So Weber says, at about the same time that the scientific management, that the bureaucracy is an ideal form of organization. And he says that bureaucracies have three characteristics. One, they're based on a hierarchy. So they're pyramidal in structure, where lower levels report to higher levels until you get to the top, which is the CEO. He says this is the ideal form of organization, is this hierarchical structure. The second characteristic of bureaucracies is that they are rule bound. You have this sort of manual of SOPs. What is a SOP? Standard operating procedure, right? It tells you how to go about your job, right? And then the third characteristic is they're highly specialized. You don't have an organization that builds roads and computer chips. Those are two disparate types of business activities, aren't they? The skill set that's necessary for building roads is not the same that's necessary for building computer chips. And then Weber views these compartments within the bureaucracy as being cogs in a machine. And if the cog isn't working, you just pull it out and replace it. So if the guy isn't shoveling enough coal into the blast furnace, you replace that cog. You can see how sort of dehumanizing that kind of attitude is, right? We're going to stand over you with a stopwatch. And if you think this doesn't still happen today, it does. I mean, I've visited these catfish farms where people are skinning, and there are people standing there with stopwatches to see how many fish they can skin in a given period of time. And we've become, in this post-industrial world, even better at this in some respects. Because we now have the ability to track these metrics with a great deal of precision through technology. And it's not just people skinning catfish. It's now even people in professions. Your employer can monitor your activity on your computer at all times. Can't they? When you log on to D2L, what does it say?
A disclaimer that says that.
There's a disclaimer that says there is no expectation of privacy in this system. Wow. That's Orwellian, isn't it? I mean, if there's one place where we should have a lot of privacy and a lot of autonomy, it's in higher education, isn't it? Now, I recognize that there are laws that are being passed in many states that say we should limit what people say. But generally speaking, those laws don't apply to higher education. They're trying in some states. In Oklahoma, they signed a bill that, attempts to limit what college professors can say about certain topics. I can guarantee you that if anybody tests those bills in court with regard to higher education, they will be found to be violative of the First. I mean, even the Supreme Court, as presently constituted, seems to have some grasp of First Amendment jurisprudence and the necessity for First Amendment rights, particularly in places like institutions of higher education, where the idea of open, honest, and fair debate has reigned paramount for 200 years of Anglo-American jurisprudence, right? So respect, how do you do this even in a system where given that we're gonna have workers that have got to skin the fishes and there has to be some standard? Well, how do you still have respect? Well, I think you can do it through having employee handbooks that are fair, that treat people and give them an opportunity to participate in their employment place to the extent possible, and that have methods for things like progressive discipline, right? Fair labor for fair pay. This is a huge debate that is raging right now. And this is one of these words. Fair is a lot like at the beginning when I asked questions, if you watch the videos, on what is justice and what does it have to do with marketing. And I had a student write in student evaluations in this class. He keeps insisting that justice has something to do with marketing. It has nothing to do with marketing. That is just a priori wrong, like just the wrong answer, right? Like justice in the sense, in the classical sense, in the Platonic sense, in the Socratic sense, is about ethics. What is just? It's not just a legal concept. That's a very narrow view of justice. It is about how do we determine what is right and ethical in the actions that we take. So what is fair labor and fair pay? Fair labor is easier to determine. It means that I should not cheat my employer out of the benefit of my services. Now, to some extent, it becomes more complicated when you deal with concrete situations. So as an attorney, in theory, and there were times, not very many, but when I was associate general counsel here at UCO, there were very few times when I was chief general counsel for a publicly traded company where I could just sit there and do nothing all day. But there were lots of times when we just didn't have a lot going on. You know, sort of towards the middle of the semester, things kind of calm down and there aren't a lot of contracts to review at various times of the year. And we didn't necessarily have a lot to do. And I could spend large portions of my day reading stuff that was sort of interesting to me, right? I could read the news or do stuff like that. And I didn't feel like I was cheating my employer because you aren't paying me necessarily for constantly doing something. You're paying me for the ability to be able to walk in and ask me questions at any time that I may need to answer. Like, can we throw the student off campus? When Roger Webb was president, he was walking across campus and there was somebody who had hung in East Hall, which was the men's dorm at that time. We tore it down to build this lovely, I don't know, LA transformative cheating quad over here. We had somebody who'd put a flag outside their window that said, you know, it was an expletive that began with F and the next word under it was Bush. At the time, George Walker Bush was president of the United States. And I guess we had at least one hippy dippy liberal student on campus who was offended by the Bush administration, and the president, who was an attorney, wanted us to get it down and expel the student. I'm like, gonna have a problem, right? Like college campus, free speech. The response was, I don't care, I want it down. I'm like, maybe we should look at the case law here. Because the case law says, he's like, well, I know we have, you can do this. It's called reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. And I'm like, doesn't meet the test, right? Of when you can limit it, we can limit free speech in certain things. Like I don't have to let somebody walk into the classroom and start, going on a tirade. But if they want to stand out by Bronco Lake and, shout death to Putin or, down with Joe Biden, well, there's not much we can do about that. So, fair labor is easier to determine. What's fair pay? This is a huge debate. Should we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour? There are economists that will argue, this is why it becomes tricky. There are economists that argue that by doing that, all you're doing is you are going to increase inflation, and $15 will no longer be a living wage either, right? I mean, if you take the basket of goods, there are two types of inflation. Economists would be horrified at my oversimplification here. What are the two types of inflation? Anybody know? There's demand pull and cost push, right? Demand pull inflation occurs when you have too many dollars chasing too few goods and services. And so the argument goes that by raising the minimum wage to $15, all of a sudden you've increased the amount of money that's out there, and it means that there will be too many dollars chasing too few goods, and prices will just go up, right? So what is fair pay? Rights and duties of employers. Well, they should have respect for their employees. We have codified most of this under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, called OSHA, which is administered by OSHA, and they should have competence in their managerial skills. I am out of time. Next week you have class time to take the next exam. If you got ducks today, come see me. That's how I keep track of participation points. And I will see you not next week, but the week after.